I'd like to introduce our speakers for this evening, Dr. Judkin Browning there in the plaid shirt, and Dr. Tim Silver sitting next to him in the khaki. Dr. Browning is a professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of History at Appalachian State University. He has written 2 military histories and is the editor of New Perspectives on the Civil War Era series at the University of Georgia Press. Dr. Silver is a professor of environmental history at Appalachian State University. His area of expertise is the environmental history of North America with an emphasis on the South and Southern Appalachia, the history of America's national and state parks, and the ethnohistory of early America. Please give a warm welcome to our speakers.
Yeah, you can come up here. I'm going to operate the clicker. Tim's going to introduce what we're doing here.
Hear me okay? Everybody here? Good. I'm Tim Silver. I'm the silver half of this, and that holds both for the order of the names and age. And I want to start by talking a little bit about what environmental history is. I often get asked, I'll tell people I do environmental history and they're like, what the heck is that? We know colonial history, we know Civil War history, we know Reconstruction history. What is environmental history? And we still in environmental history kind of struggle for a definition, but in its simplest terms, environmental history starts with a kind of basic premise that whatever people do, whatever they do every day, they do within the larger context of the natural world. Even an act as simple as breathing takes place within this larger context of nature and the natural world. And if that seems a bit basic or maybe elementary, try this. When my students ask me, what is environmental history? I always tell them it's history with the plants and animals and the rocks and the trees left in and not left out, as they usually are in other types of history. So, and I want to say one other word about how Judkin and I came to write this book. Working in environmental history, I was doing a book on an area of Western North Carolina, and I found myself in front of the courthouse over in Yancey County, North Carolina, a little town called Burnsville. And there's a memorial there to the Confederate dead. I got to looking at that. I wasn't, didn't know any of the names, but I was interested in counting them up. And there was something at that time like 150 odd Confederate dead. And I knew enough to know that there are also people who fought for the Union and so forth. So I started asking myself, it's a very small North Carolina county. What in the world did it mean to take that many humans off the land? What did it mean for agriculture? What did it mean for survival of families? How did all this work together? So I sort of started formulating the idea of an environmental history of the Civil War. And like a lot of my ideas, it turned out to be more complicated than I thought it would be. I figured, well, I'm an environmental historian. I'll just go read all the books on the Civil War, and then I'll be ready. Well, then I discovered there are 55,000 plus books on the Civil War. That's the equivalent for one per day since Lee's surrender at Appomattox, roughly so. So, like I said, I'm the silver half of this. So I knew in this lifetime, there's no way I was going to read all those books. But there was a guy down the hall who I knew had read all those books.
Really didn't take that long either.
He's a Civil War historian and a military historian. So we decided to put our heads together and see what we could come up with. And, what would the Civil War look like if we thought about it, not so much as a military event, but as an environmental or even a biological event? How did the Civil War begin to change that natural world around the people who were participating in it? And conversely, how did that natural world then affect the war. One of the things wars do is they put people in motion. And once people get in motion, things start happening in the natural world. So that's where we're coming from. We're going to look at the book as look at the Civil War as a kind of environmental, biological, or as the scientists say, a biotic event. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to my esteemed colleague here.
Thank you.
Who's going to talk a little bit about weather.
So, yeah, thank you. So you came for the main event, which is, as the title says, Slogging to Richmond, Environmental Influences on the Union's Failed Peninsula Campaign. So I'm going to work off the premise that many of you are probably more educated about the Civil War than the average person on the street. And so you may be familiar with the Peninsula Campaign, not to give away the ending, but Union General George McClellan embarks on a campaign in April of 1862 to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, and that campaign fails. And there was no reason in the world that it should have failed. It did not appear that there was any reason in the world it should have failed, given how large an army he had, given all the obstacles that the Confederate army faced. So what we're going to do is talk about how the environment played a role in the failure of that campaign. And if you're going to talk about Richmond and how the environment played a role in Richmond, the most logical place to start, of course, is California. So, so that's where we're going to start. To show you how weather played an extremely important role in the Civil War. And so 1862 was an unusual weather year. And so the clearest effects of how unusual the weather is can be seen in California, which most people who think about the Civil War don't even consider California a part of the United States practically, right? I mean, it was a state, had become a state in 1850. About 500,000 people lived in California. But nonetheless, let's start our story in California, where a major weather event occurs. It starts raining in California just after Christmas of 1861, and it continues to rain almost nonstop for the next 3 months. It's something known as an atmospheric river, which if you've been paying attention to the news in the last month or so, you've heard that terminology on the Weather Channel as they talk about the flooding that has occurred in California thanks to atmospheric rivers. The difference is the atmospheric river that hit California in 1862 dropped the equivalent of 15 Mississippi rivers onto California. Climatologists call this type of event an arc storm. AR for atmospheric river, K as in a once in a 1,000-year event, K meaning 1,000. And then, of course, storm being self-evident. But also like the sort of, I don't know if they did this deliberately, scientists aren't always the most clever guys, but I like the idea arc storm sort of like gives the impression of like, you know, Noah on his boat, right? There's a lot of rain. But what happened with the rain in California, and it's going to happen all throughout the southern half of the United States, what happens is it just causes immense flooding. Let's give a few examples here. So it rained for 45 days straight in early 1862. To give us some examples, in the city of San Francisco, which gets an average of 12 inches of rain annually, it rained 37 inches just in the first 3 months of 1862. It rained 66 inches in Los Angeles. LA normally gets 10 inches of rain a year. And it rained 102 inches in Sonora, California, which is just at the eastern edge of the Central Valley. It's on the Sierra Nevada mountain range. It normally gets 22 inches. So all of that rain caused immense flooding. Everything you see in white means it was underwater. It turned the Central Valley of California into a giant inland sea. And it also caused enormous damage. It killed 200,000 cattle in California. You also have stories of riverboats, like steamboats, steaming up the Central Valley to rescue both cattle and farmers because it was that dire an event. It caused more than $10 million worth of damage, which is the equivalent of $300 million worth of damage in today's money. And this is for a state in which only 500,000 people live. So it was a major catastrophic event. It actually got so bad in California that the residents of California had to import wheat from Chile on the South American coast in order to survive, because they couldn't get any supplies from the eastern part of the United States, not only because of the flooding, but also because there was a big war going on and the federal government couldn't divert supplies to California. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, first of all, just sort of set up how important a role weather plays, and also to set up one of the central ironies of this story. All of this rain that we're talking about, that we're going to continue talking about as it affects the East Coast, all of this rain occurs in the middle of something that historians refer to as the Civil War drought. This was actually a time of unusually low rainfall, and California had the worst storm in its recorded history. Now, I'm not an environmental historian, but luckily I happen to have one. Tim, how in the hell does it rain this many inches during the middle of a drought?
Well, and actually, this is a really good example of how our research on the book worked. You know, Judkin would discover something like this and he'd come and say, Tim, how the hell did this happen? Well, we know that without getting too far into the meteorological weeds here, we know that currents in the Pacific Ocean have a lot to do with our weather here and with weather across the continental United States. And there are two particular sort of trends in Pacific Ocean currents that affect our weather. One is called El Nino, and that generally brings wetter, cooler weather to our region. The other is something called La Nina, which brings generally drier conditions. So this took place in the middle of a La Nina, in the middle of a drought, as Judkin says. Now, a drought doesn't mean that it never rains. It just means that however you calculate averages, and I always tell my students that averages are a human creation. They have nothing to do with nature. Nature doesn't calculate averages. But however you calculate averages, you know, you talk about a drought, that's long term. Doesn't mean that it never rains. So why did it start raining? Well, digging into this a little bit, we discovered that if you're in the middle of a La Nina, one of these dry periods, there's a certain kind of wobble that occurs in that current. And it doesn't have to be much, just a little bit. And it can touch off this kind of atmospheric river that sucks up all this moisture from the tropics and starts funneling it across the United States. And we think that's what happened in 1862. It begins to rain everywhere. So it brings us right to the idea that weather is, you know, it's not something you can predict. It's unpredictable. Even now, we have about 36 hours of, you know, decent weather predictions with all the technology we have. We can't calculate these things. So it brings into any study of the Civil War an element of chaos, an element of the unplanned and the unanticipated.
You want me to go back? Is it
Yeah,
my turn?
go ahead.
Okay. So let's move eastward because we want to get to Richmond, right? And see how does the weather affect the campaign. Just to let you know, so it's raining more than anybody's ever seen in California before, but it's also raining throughout the rest of the southern part of the United States. For instance, some of you are familiar with the Fort Henry campaign in early February of 1862, when Ulysses S. Grant leads a combined naval and army force to capture the fort separating Tennessee from Kentucky, and Fort Henry is along the Tennessee River. Well, the Confederate engineers who laid out Fort Henry in the summer of 1861 laid it out foolishly in the floodplain of the Tennessee River. And their logic undoubtedly was, this isn't going to be a long war. It hasn't flooded here in quite a long time. Therefore, it's not going to flood here. And what do you know? The very first year after they build the fort, the biggest flood the Tennessee River had seen in 50 years occurs thanks to this weather event. What that means is by the time Grant's naval gunboats arrive on the Tennessee River, Fort Henry is the thing that's circled here in yellow. It's under 20 feet of water. I mean, the fort was built on the floodplain. The Tennessee River rose 30 feet above its banks. Therefore, the fort was 20 feet underwater. Didn't really have to do much in order to capture Fort Henry. So the Tennessee River flooded beyond its banks, but also the Mississippi River, the Yazoo River, the Ouachita River, all flooded that spring. Not only is it causing a lot of damage to Southern crops, but it's also, of course, affecting military campaigns. We're not going to talk about the Battle of Shiloh in this campaign, in this talk, but the Battle of Shiloh occurs where it does because of the flooding of the Mississippi River. The only reason that the Union Army put their campsite at Pittsburgh Landing, where the Shiloh battlefield was because it was the only piece of high ground in that region of southern Tennessee that wasn't underwater. It was the only dry ground they could find, and therefore the Battle of Shiloh takes place there. But let's finally move ourselves to Virginia, where the rain, of course, is going to affect McClellan. So let's back up a little bit and talk about, why is McClellan even in this region? Why does McClellan decide to land at the southern tip of the Virginia Peninsula near modern-day Norfolk, Virginia, and march overland to Richmond? His commander-in-chief, President Abraham Lincoln, wanted McClellan to take the direct route from DC to Richmond. So just think, he wanted him to follow the modern-day course of I-95, which, given the rate of traffic, it probably would have taken McClellan as long to get to Richmond as it did here. But the very reason that McClellan doesn't take that route, even though it would in some ways be the most logical and the most direct, McClellan doesn't take it because Lincoln suggested it. So here's where human personalities come into play, right? Tim and I wrote an essay that got published before the book came out called Nature and Human Nature, saying that the environment doesn't determine outcomes. How humans respond to the environment determines outcomes. Well, this is a case where human nature sort of played a role. McClellan sort of grew to despise Lincoln, not because Lincoln had done anything negative toward McClellan, but because McClellan was a West Point graduate. He had finished second in his class at West Point in 1846. Lincoln had never gone to any formal school, certainly not a military academy. And so the idea that a civilian commander-in-chief with no serious military experience would make suggestions to the general of the army, George McClellan, second in his class at West Point, was appalling to McClellan. And so basically, even if Lincoln made a good suggestion to McClellan, he would ignore it because Lincoln made it. And it sort of poisoned the relationship between those two. And so McClellan decides, I'm going to go to the Virginia Peninsula and march overland to Richmond that way in order to make this campaign my own. The problem is that McClellan hadn't done an awful lot of research on the Virginia Peninsula, didn't exactly even know which direction some of the rivers along the peninsula flowed. And so when he gets to the peninsula and he disembarks his troops and he starts marching to Richmond, he's somewhat surprised by the lay of the land. And as soon as it starts raining, it just sort of brings out the worst in McClellan. And it starts raining. So McClellan disembarks his troops on April 4th. And he lands in the peninsula with about 100,000 soldiers, the largest army in American history up until that point. We had never had an army larger in any U.S. military force in its history. And so with 100,000 troops, McClellan is going to march on Richmond. He quickly disembarks about 60,000 of them, and he starts marching, and his enthusiasm for marching lasts exactly one day. And then it started raining, and then McClellan encountered some Confederate defenders along a river that McClellan didn't even know flowed in the direction that it flowed, and it caused McClellan to back up and be cautious. And let's talk about, what does the rain do to the armies on both sides, but certainly the Union Army, because they're the ones being the aggressor. First of all, it rains in April. It rains 16 out of the 30 days in April, and we're not talking a gentle shower. These are sort of biblical deluges that come down in 16 out of 30 days in April. Then it rains for 10 straight days in May. Now, this is an area that didn't have a large population base, did not have anything remotely resembling paved roads. And I like to choose one quote from a Union chaplain who says, "The roads here are beyond description. Just imagine the worst roads possible and then believe that these are 99 times worse than your imagination, and you may then come near the truth." Now, I like to point out, this Union chaplain was from the frontier of Michigan, okay? So not exactly a place known for good roads. So if this dude says, "My God, I have never seen roads this bad," then you probably ought to believe it. So basically the Union Army is stuck sort of slogging through the mud. Well, certainly it slows down progress, but what does it actually do to the soldiers? And so we decided to look at what is the basic metabolic rate for Union soldiers and how many calories would they burn marching through mud? Now, this may come as a surprise to a lot of you, and it did to us. The average weight of a Civil War soldier was 143 pounds. So, I mean, I would be a heavy giant in the Civil War Army. But a 143-pound man marching through mud would burn roughly 550 calories an hour. Now, the Union Army in this campaign and the Confederate Army, while it's retreating, could easily march 8 or 10 miles in a day, and it would probably take them 10 hours or longer to accomplish that. And so if you're burning 550 calories an hour, you're talking about soldiers that are burning easily without blinking an eye or burning 5,000 calories a day. Well, then it begs the question, how many calories are they consuming? Burning 5,000 calories is no big deal if you're replenishing that energy and getting adequate nutrition. So we looked at that. What are soldiers eating at this time and how close are they coming to matching their output? So let's just look at the daily Army rations at the time of this campaign. So just go to the published 1860 U.S. Army Daily Ration Guide, which both armies used as their basic blueprint for rations during the Civil War. And if you ate only your daily Army ration, you would get either a substantial amount of beef or pork, and then a substantial amount of flour or cornmeal. And then they would throw in some rice or beans or dried potatoes, and you get some coffee or tea, and you get some sugar and salt and vinegar. And in 1861, the federal government thought, yeah, it's probably important that we throw vegetables in there too. So just throw some vegetables in there. But they found that delivering fresh vegetables was too difficult. They rotted too quickly before they got to the army. So they dried the vegetables and sent them as sort of block packages of dried vegetables. And all the soldiers hated them. And so they wouldn't eat the dried vegetables. And of course, that's going to lead to some illnesses because you're not getting the nutrients from the vegetables. But anyway, if you ate only your U.S. Army daily ration, you would consume between 3,500 and 4,000 calories a day. Now, that's quite a lot, right? Because if you think about it, today, the USDA recommends that the average adult needs about 2,000 calories a day. But the average adult is not a combat soldier performing duty in a combat zone. So that's why U.S. Army rations are more. But the trick is nobody's getting their full daily rations. If you're a soldier, the rations are in the supply wagons, and the supply wagons are stuck in the rear, and they're stuck in the mud. And so the rations, you could go 3, 4, 5 days before you get a resupply of rations. And so you're surviving on whatever's in your backpack. If you're a Union soldier, that means hardtack, which is as many of you know, a deeply hard baked biscuit, some say that sharp enough to break teeth or knock out a full-grown steer. And what you're drinking is most likely coffee, which of course is a diuretic, which is, dehydrating you while you're replenishing your needs with only dry bread. And sometimes it's worse than that. Let's look at a Confederate soldier from the 5th Texas on May 19th, 1862, details in a letter home, being without rations, 4 ears of corn were dealt out to each man for the day's meal. 4 ears of corn is roughly a little bit more than 300 calories. So you're burning 5,000 calories and you're consuming 300 calories. It's not going to take long before the human body breaks down. And one of the things that people know about the Peninsula Campaign is there was a lot of sickness. There was a lot of illness. And now we're starting to see why. It's not just that they're marching through mud and that tires you out, but they're not replenishing any or not nearly enough of those calories. But there's also another, to a lot of people, hidden hazard that they don't think about. Yes, McClellan has 100,000 men in his army on the peninsula, slogging through the mud and not getting enough to eat and not drinking good water. But there's also something else that's in that campaign with them. You want this?
Go ahead.
Our four-legged friends.
Bring it up. I didn't know if I was going to get the mic back there for a second.
He gets an extended run.
Yeah, I always like these things because I'm not a Civil War historian, but I get to play one at night. 40,000 horses, and that sort of just sometimes bounces off of us. But when we started doing this book, I went out and spent some time with a friend of mine who has horses. I didn't know anything about them, you know. And horses are, first of all, very large animals. You're talking about a 1,000-pound animal. And just about everything that moved on a Civil War battlefield moved as a result of animal power, usually horses. And we know about some close relationships that Confederate and Union generals had with their horses, et cetera. But most people viewed them as machines. They just, moved gear from one place to another. Horses require about 26 pounds of hay and oats or some kind of grain per day. And they don't do well just on hay or grass. But the problem with disease begins to come about because what goes in a horse has to come out of a horse. And it comes out on the other end. And horses produce, we discovered on the low end, 35 pounds, each horse, 35 pounds of manure a day. On the high end, 50 pounds of manure a day, along with about 4 to 6 gallons of urine per horse per day. 40,000 horses. We did the math. That's 700 tons of manure and 160,000 gallons of urine per day being spilled along the peninsula. And soldiers are marching through this. And as one Union private put it, and Judkin talked about how thirsty people got, the dehydration, the malnutrition. As one Union private put it, we were glad to drink rainwater, which had settled in the wheel ruts made by the passing artillery. And it doesn't take much imagination to figure out what that water in the wheel rut passing artillery might look and taste like. There's another thing with horses. Horses died in the Civil War, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. But as to how many and so forth, killed in battle. They were also killed by disease. When you brought horses together from around the country that had not been together before, it's just like bringing people together who haven't been associated before. And so diseases begin to spread, things like greased heel and glanders, which kills horses in droves. It's sometimes called farcy. And then horses get killed in battle, of course. And one of the problems you have right away is, what do you do with a dead horse? And even now, there are only 3 ways to get rid of a dead horse. You can bury it, which usually requires a backhoe or something similar. You can burn it, or you can just leave it. And during the Civil War, the most popular means of dealing with dead horses was either to burn them, and that's what's actually going on in this, I think this is 7 Pines, right?
Yeah.
Where you can look in the background there and see the flames. To burn the carcasses, usually throwing a lot of wood and something like some lamp oil on it to get it started, and then you just fire it up and let the horses burn. Gave off a terrible stench. And if you've ever read about Gettysburg, you remember that disposing of the horses smelled for days around there. So horses sort of add to this environment, this muddy miasma that soldiers are marching through and drinking water. Okay, let's talk microorganisms here. Microorganisms have, as we all know from having experienced COVID, they have one function in life, and that is to reproduce. And they reproduce well whenever you get different groups of human beings together under unhealthy conditions. 2 of the big problems are typhoid fever and dysentery. And I'll tell you right now, I'm looking out on this audience, about 1/3 of you are carrying an organism that will cause typhoid fever. So you can look around and decide who that is, and don't drink after them. Another 1/3 of you are carrying an organism that can cause dysentery. So that's, you know, that's the other third over here. But we don't have a problem with these microorganisms as a general rule. Hopefully we're not going to leave here and come down with typhoid fever and or dysentery. If we are, I have dibs on the bathroom, but that's not going to happen. And the reason it's not going to happen is because we have clean water and we're not living close together. These men were in camp, they were drinking contaminated water, marching on short rations. It's a prescription for diseases like typhoid fever and dysentery. In fact, you can almost imagine the microbes here, if you sort of give them some human characteristics, kind of lining up and, you know, here we go, guys, you know, it's that city we're going in. So you know, can kind of think of it that way. And you can read the statistics as they come up here. At one point, 920 out of 1,150 men in the 5th North Carolina Regiment had typhoid fever. And as if typhoid and dysentery weren't enough for the Union Army, let's throw in some scurvy. We often joke about scurvy now. We think about pirates and we say things like, you scurvy dog, you know, like it's something not very serious. Scurvy is a terrible malady. It results, as you know, from a vitamin C deficiency, but it can really, I mean, it just wreaks havoc in people. Your gums recede, your teeth fall out, you become crippled. And that became a problem in part, as Judkin was saying, because the soldiers didn't eat the vegetables that they were provided with. And it took a while to get them into that habit. And then if typhoid, dysentery, and scurvy aren't enough, let's throw in a little bit of malaria. Malaria had been around on the Virginia Peninsula since the colonial period in a couple of forms, but it had sort of reached an ecological kind of equilibrium. People acquired some immunity to the parasites that were there. Malaria is caused by a parasite carried by mosquitoes, as you know. They didn't know that at the time. And things had sort of leveled out, and there was an uneasy equilibrium between the parasites and the humans. People got sick with malaria, it tends to recur, but there wasn't really what you would call another terrible outbreak of it until you bring in, what, about 90,000 fresh northern troops, most of whom haven't been exposed to malaria, most of whom haven't developed any sort of natural resistance to malaria, and it breaks out again. And add to that, that the Army, as it's moving, is creating all kinds of great habitats for mosquitoes, trench lines, the barrels of water, wagon ruts we talked about a little while ago. So you're talking about an ideal environment for microbes here to make people sick. And one of the problems that, well, you can see the statistic here, by the end of the campaign in July, 40,000 of 100,000, I'm no mathematician, that's about 40% are sick. Even with these diseases, we can name these, they were known at the time, but there's also a problem that's really more of a symptom than a disease, and we don't know what exactly what it was, and that's diarrhea. More statistics, and 20,000 people were completely incapacitated by diarrhea, and throw in another 5,000 with malaria, 2,000 with typhoid, and you can see what begins to happen here. And my colleague loves to talk about diarrhea.
I mean, yeah.
I was going to say he's an expert on diarrhea, but let me leave that there. He likes to talk about diarrhea. One of the things we discovered talking with, I think it was Pete Carmichael, who said that somebody had gone through Civil War records and discovered 17 different spellings for diarrhea. So I'm going to let him come up and talk a little bit about how bad diarrhea had to be before you sought medical aid for it. So,
right. I mean, it's one thing to say 20,000 out of 100,000 soldiers were incapacitated by diarrhea. I mean, look, hey, we've all been there, right? And so, like, when I teach my students, they get it, like, oh yeah, okay, well, 1 out of 5 people had diarrhea. Now I get it, it sucks for them, but then I point out, like, look, we've all had diarrhea. right? So how bad does your diarrhea have to be for you to take yourself to the ER to get treated for it? Because that's the equivalent here. Soldiers did not voluntarily go to the hospital with illness. Civil War soldiers had a negative reputation or a negative view of hospitals during the war. They thought hospitals were places you only went to die. And so they tried to avoid them at all costs. And so for a Civil War soldier to take himself or have himself carried to a hospital because he simply cannot stop the diarrhea means it's really bad. What it also means is for every one soldier who gets reported to the hospital with diarrhea, you probably have 2, maybe 3 who have diarrhea, but they're just gritting their teeth and riding it out in their tent, so to speak. And of course, it becomes a vicious cycle because if you have diarrhea, I mean, you have latrines where you're supposed to go to the bathroom, but I mean, if nature calls, most soldiers are too weak to make it to the latrines. And so they're lucky if they can get outside their tent and take care of business. And then of course the rains come and wash all of that into the nearest water supply, and around the mulberry bush we go. And this is what's happening. And this is why Civil War armies are sick all the time. And so when you talk about at the end of the Peninsula Campaign, when you put it in perspective that 40,000 of the 100,000 men in McClellan's army were sick with something, and 20,000 of those 40,000 were incapacitated with diarrhea. And you just think, well, probably another 40,000 more had diarrhea, but just hadn't taken themselves to the hospital. Then you get a sense of how difficult it is to wage any military campaign during the Civil War, but certainly how difficult the Peninsula Campaign was. And the rains came, and it made the Union Army's advance infinitely more difficult because, of course, it weakened the soldiers who had to march through the mud. They drank bad water. They weren't getting enough nutrition. The horses contributed their own hazards. Everybody's getting sick. In fact, there was such a case of diarrhea amongst the Union Army that some soldiers had it for 6 or 8 months longer. It earned its own nickname. It was called the Chickahominy fever. It was a way, because the Chickahominy River flowed by Richmond, and it was just a way of saying, yeah, I got this diarrhea during the Richmond campaign. And for some guys, they're dealing with it for almost a year after the campaign's over. And so it's not that McClellan didn't make mistakes. Of course he did. And he made a lot of them. But it's also that the environmental influences were bringing out the worst in McClellan and bringing out the worst in his army. And so just to go back to the horse theme for a moment, we talked about horses, but we want to talk about livestock losses in general, because the Peninsula Campaign happens in 1862. The war goes on for 3 more years. There is a lot more livestock loss during the war, and it's going to affect the South for generations after the war is over. So let's just put some of these numbers in perspective and sort of reinforce some of the horse statistics that Tim gave to you. Number 1, the South lost approximately 40% of all of its livestock during the war. 40% of all the horses, cattle, and hogs during the war no longer existed in the South once the war was over. Throughout the United States, throughout the nation, North and South, 1.2 million horses and mules died during the war. That's 1 out of every 6 equines in the United States died during the war. The Civil War literally was a horse holocaust, if you will. I mean, if you think 16% of the total horse population dying, if 16% of the total US population died during the Civil War, we'd be talking about 6 million people who died during the war. We talk today about 620,000 people who died, and we think that's terrible, and it was, but it wasn't anywhere near the sort of comparative losses of the horse population. And another thing to point out is that the United States, when the war began, everyone had to make do with the horses that existed in the country at that moment. There were no horse breeding farms in the United States to make military horses or to make horses that can stand military service. And even if the powers that be on either side wanted to start a horse breeding farm, let's say the day that the South fired on Fort Sumter, if they started a horse breeding farm that day, the earliest horses that could be used for military service would have been ready for use in February of 1866, 10 months after the war was over. because a horse requires approximately a 9 to 10-month gestation period to, from conception to birth. And then the military doesn't want a horse until it's at least 4 years old because it's not considered strong enough to endure military service until that time. So therefore, even if you had started a horse breeding farm, you would not have been able to get any horses before the war was over. And to put it in perspective, by 1870, 5 years after the war was over, the South still only had 2/3 as many horses as they had had before the war began. That's how devastating it is in the South. And think about horses that pull the plows to provide the food for the South, the horses that pull the wagons to carry crops to market. 2/3, 1/3, like less, only 2/3 as many horses 5 years after the war is over than there were before the war began. And we can't really talk about livestock without talking about that other ubiquitous livestock animal in the South, and that is, of course, our friend, the hog. There are lots of accounts about how in the South, what was a staple of the diet at every Southern table, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, was pork in some form and corn in some form. So pork was the basic meat that Southerners ate. The average Southerner ate approximately 150 pounds of pork a year, okay? So that's a lot of pork that we're consuming. So how did the hog population fare during the Civil War? And the answer is really, really badly. So just look at these numbers here. On the left is the population, according to the Agricultural Census of the United States, of the hog population in these southern states in 1860, before the war began. And then in 1865 is the estimated hog population based on the agricultural studies that were done by the U.S. Army in the wake of the Civil War. And then on the far right, you can see the percentage of the hog population that was lost in each state during the war. Notice basically every southern state lost 70% or more of their hog population. From consumption, just from eating the hogs, from raids, Union armies coming and taking the hogs, and from devastating epidemics like hog cholera that could wipe out large sections of the hog population. Look at the state of South Carolina, where the war began. They're the first state to secede. Almost 1 million hogs in 1860, only 150,000 in 1865. They lost 85% of their hog population. You were not getting good barbecue in South Carolina in 1865.
Even now.
And quite frankly, not much has changed. Let's be honest, right? I know South Carolina is nearby. So, if somebody can explain the mustard-based sauce to me, then maybe I'll understand it. But this shows that the war had a deeply devastating impact on the South because it took away their primary source of nutrition. It took away their primary engine, if you will, to grow crops. It's no wonder the South took so long to recover agriculturally after the war. And I want to finish here before we leave. I'll set it back up with Tim so he can offer some sort of environmental musings about, if it hadn't rained so much, would McClellan have captured Richmond? And sort of what lessons can we learn from looking at the Civil War through an environmental lens? You want to bring it home?
Sure. I said when we started that what would the war look like if we reimagined it as a biological or an environmental event? Well, what we've done here is just give you a little flavor of that and what's in our book. We go on in the book to talk about the effects of food, the effects, and we have a whole chapter on animals. We have a chapter on death. It forced people to find new ways of dealing with the dead as a kind of an ecological fact. We look at terrain and things like scarcity of salt. And we also look a little bit at the environmental legacy of the war. And I want to touch on that just for a second, because there are some things that we don't really think about the Civil War doing that because of it, things were never the same. One of these, we've been talking about livestock losses. Before the Civil War, there were no professional schools of veterinary medicine in the United States. that came directly out of the Civil War, in part to deal with the huge loss of horses and hogs and even cattle in the South. The first public school of veterinary medicine started at Iowa State after the Civil War. The Department of Agriculture came out of the Civil War, something we take almost for granted now. The National Weather Service was formed from a Civil War brigade. The Signal Corps became the National Weather Service under Ulysses S. Grant, who had seen more than his share of bad weather during the Civil War. And my favorite example, because I teach a class on national parks, or did teach a class on national parks, is people don't often make this connection. But when the first area in the Western United States was set aside, and that's Yosemite, the Yosemite Valley, it was set aside, turned over to the state of California in 1864, right in the middle of some of the bloodiest fighting of the Civil War. So while Lincoln's worried about troops and all, he's also got a resolution working its way through the House and Senate to set aside this pristine valley in California. And research is ongoing on this, but there are a fair number of scholars who believe that the effort to create national parks, to preserve these still unmarred landscapes in the West, came right out of the Civil War and the incredible destruction that was going on in the East, and that should not be repeated on the landscape of the West. And of course, the first true national park is Yellowstone, and it happens under Grant's administration in 1872. There's a long kind of environmental legacy here. However, when we first came out with this book and articles, that wasn't what people wanted to talk about. Historians wanted to ask us, well, look, what are you guys saying here? Like Judkin said, if it doesn't rain, McClellan goes to Richmond, he takes the city, he ends the war, there's no Emancipation Proclamation. That sounds like determinism. That sounds like environmental determinism. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that you understand McClellan better, and you understand his slowness, his sort of agonizing trip up the peninsula, if you understand that all this takes place in a broader natural context. And, you know, people started accusing us of apologizing for McClellan, and we're like, wait, no. We just want you to understand what's going on. And when you come down to it, if you really want to talk about environment, I think you can make a good case, and people made it at the time, that the lack of horses and the lack of hogs in the South, by the time the war was over, really had a serious effect on, you know, the Southern defeat. So with that, I will just say, you know, we're not environmental determinists. We're not trying to rewrite the history of the Civil War. We just want to broaden our perspective a little bit and have people think about some different issues. And with that, I will thank John and Ann and Wally and everybody else who's been so good to us here. And thank you all for coming, and we'll be happy to take your questions. And by the way, we have books for sale. So, sure.
Like we always do, we'll try to be quiet as a few people have to leave, and we'll take questions, and I'll run around as best I can, and I'll start right up here.
Okay, so with McClellan, obviously at the top of his class, or second in his class, a pretty sharp guy. Did they have any studies at all at that point? I mean, I'm sure these guys were looking at wars over the past 2,000 years. Was there any type of schooling or education about the environmental impact on battles at that time? And if there wasn't, I mean, obviously, I guess there wasn't, are they doing any of that now?
So to answer the second part of that question, the answer is yes. To answer the first part, not really. So, you know, what we were teaching at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, teaching our officers, was essentially the Napoleonic style of warfare. And the we were using Napoleon as the beau ideal of what a general was, because Napoleon was always aggressive. He always seemed to achieve the element of surprise, and we studied his battles in great detail, especially major victories like Austerlitz or whatnot. And so the thing that was the environmental theme that was studied the most was terrain. And so every military officer understood that certainly weather plays a role. I mean, a swollen creek is going to be harder to cross. It might take longer to get from point A to point B and that kind of thing. But they really studied terrain, and actually West Point was largely an engineering school, teaching officers how to utilize terrain to their greatest advantage. But there wasn't an awful lot of study put into managing a soldier's health, managing an animal's health, managing the sort of weakness that rain brings to soldiers. And so it wasn't something that they really had prepared for at the time of the Civil War. It is something that the U.S. Army studies and prepares for today. In fact, it's sort of a core part of the curriculum at not only West Point, but the Citadel, VMI, and schools of that ilk as well.
Other questions? Other questions?
Hi, granted the roads were poor,
Right.
and they had a lack of maps, so they didn't know the terrain that well. What was the impact of the swampland on them?
Well, if you've spent any time at all in that part of Virginia, you know that peninsula is, can you hear me now? Okay, sorry. You know that peninsula is sort of, it's a system of rivers, and you can just be going along in the forest and you'll come upon one of these sort of cross swamps that, dot the area. And they were a problem for McClellan. The other thing that, that we got into here was McClellan, for a guy, and I'm again, not a Civil War historian, but just looking at this as a historian, for a guy who prided himself on planning and preparation, he really knew a lot about this place. He didn't know where these swamps were, what kind of obstacles they might create. He had bad maps of the area. So, there were those kinds of logistical problems. He also had a problem because he took this particular route. He had a problem that he didn't know about that really dated back at least 10,000 years. And that was the geology of this Virginia Peninsula, where, to try not to get too complex with it, there was over 10,000 years, there had been a bed of clay laid down and then sand on top of it. And we're going way back here, like I said, 10,000 years. So that when it began to rain, what happened is what geologists call a process called liquefaction. And what that did was the rain went through the sand, the clay turned into a consistency of something about like wet cement. And so that's why there was so much mud and so many problems. And actually horses and mules died, in that mud, suffocated in it. So if McClellan had been inclined to listen to Lincoln, perhaps, he could have gone north and west of there and probably wouldn't have had nearly as many problems as he did going over that sandy clay soil and the swamps. Yeah.
Other questions? Coming over. Here we come. I-95 back up. I-95 back up.
Hi, is this on? Great presentation.
Thanks.
I was in a terrain detachment in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And reported to headquarters of U.S. Army Vietnam. And it was my responsibility to study the geology and environmental conditions to keep the troops from slogging through the mud.
Right.
So the lessons that you've described with McClellan and the disease and the other factors have been now
Right.
to some extent taken into account. And I've got some great stories, but this is Brunswick Civil War Roundtable, not the Vietnam War Roundtable.
Right.
So I'll pass the microphone.
I will say in response to that, I am waiting not so patiently for someone to write an environmental history of the Vietnam War. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff there. I mean, you got Agent Orange and the Army, what was it, the Air Force Operation Popeye or whatever. They tried to make it rain and, you know.
Right.
But I'm patiently waiting on that, so.
Welcome home, sir. Other questions? Other questions? Other questions? Going once? Here we are. We got time for about 2 more questions.
Thank you. I was just wondering, the total casualties of the war, I really wonder if anybody was ever able to do some kind of an estimate of how many died in battle with gunshot wounds or died of disease.
Right. Well, so based on the U.S. Army War Department statistics, the number that they've historically have always used is 620,000. And of that, approximately 1/3 died of battle, either killed in battle or died of their wounds, and 2/3 died of disease. But what more recent demographic historians have done in the last 10 years is actually raised that number and said, if you look at the population base in 1860 and look at the population in 1870 and compare what it should be based on a normal growth rate, that historians now have agreed on a new number for the number of people who died in the Civil War, and that new number is 750,000. But it's still the same ratio, roughly about 250,000 who died directly from battle and 500,000 who died of disease.
And that was actually an improvement over
Previous wars.
In terms of the disease to battle ratio.
Yeah.
Going once, going, one more. This is it. Last question of the evening before the speakers will come down here and sign a book just for you. Who had their hand up? Right there.
And of course, you can ask us questions then too.
Sure.
I'm just curious. I'm not a historian or I go to this, but I'm not a Civil War guy, but I'm curious. I'm sure you've been involved in discussions about this peninsula engagement and so on. What in the world would be the advantage of him to go up the peninsula, excuse me, as opposed to going directly down 95? I mean, if I had to march my Cub Scouts somewhere, I think I would go down a dry piece of land, then go over rivers. And I mean, Washington went through all that I mean, what was the advantage for him to go that route?
So
there must have been arguments about this.
So his argument was to go directly from DC to Richmond, you have to cross over a number of rivers. And so, you would have to cross the Rappahannock and the Rapidan and the Mattapony River and all those on your way to Richmond and eventually Chickahominy. And so his argument was there are too many obstacles that are too easy to defend if you march directly from Washington to Richmond. And so he sold the argument that if I land on the peninsula, I'll catch the Confederate Army by surprise, because the main Confederate Army was up at Fredericksburg at the time. And so his argument was, if I land at the peninsula, I can get to Richmond before the Confederate Army really knows what's going on. So with a rapid march, I can get to Richmond and capture Richmond really before the Confederates have a chance to respond. But then, of course, what happens is McClellan was innately cautious. And then when it rained and he encountered Confederate soldiers at a river, the Warwick River, specifically near Yorktown, that he did not anticipate the river flowing the way that it did and the Confederate soldiers being there, it caused McClellan to sort of change his plan from this rapid march to this, he actually enacted a siege. He wanted to bring in his heavy artillery and bombard the Confederate defensive position. Well, what that did was it allowed the Confederate Army at Fredericksburg time to come down and take up defensive positions. And so it turned it into the slow march. But McClellan's arguments that he made, and the ones that Lincoln accepted grudgingly, but he accepted, was I can move more rapidly up the peninsula because there aren't going to be any rivers that are blocking my path. I can use the rivers to my advantage, and it would prevent me from having to cross so many rivers on the way to Richmond. It's just that the environment and McClellan's cautious inclinations took over.
It's hard to think of the element of surprise with 90,000 troops and 40,000
well, there's that
horses. And I would only add to that the Confederate newspapers and people in the South who were in the know, they were quite happy to see McClellan start up the peninsula if that's how he was going to come, because they knew he was going to get stuck in the mud and they weren't going to be able to move.
Yeah.
There was some quote from a newspaper writer, something about they'll have to turn into mud turtles
We'll have to
and
turn into amphibians.
amphibians. Yeah, if they want to get to Richmond. So.
How about another round of applause for a great